All right, so in my last session here, I did the sky. The sky is basically done. I did the mountains. I mean, I don't think they need more than that. You could do more in there, but I'm leaving the mountains as done. And I was working on the water. And a lot of these like sort of long shadows and reflections of the trees and the ripples that I did, I'm going to call those pretty much done. I might add a little bit more to it around the edges, but for me, the water is basically done. So again, I'm going to work from background to foreground, light to dark, and then as far as the paint goes, thin to thick. So you can see everything's pretty washy and pretty thin for the most part. Most of the colors that I used were pretty light. As I went along, I added a few dark ones. I think at this point now I'm going to start messing around with the trees and maybe some of the other things that you see over there. Now, generally, if I was doing something like this, like with the forest, I would paint like the ones further back first. But there are also some really light yellow trees up in the foreground and yellow bushes and things like that. So I have a little bit of a conundrum. Should I paint what's in the background to the foreground, or should I paint what's light to dark? And if you're stuck on a particular part of a painting where you're like, I don't know if to choose from background, foreground, or light to dark, with gouache and watercolor, always stick with light. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my yellow trees first. Now, I have a couple different ways to kind of make them textured and everything else like that. All of this stuff is just underpainting, stuff that's going to get covered up later on. But since there is sort of like a thicket of forest back here, I just wanted to have some background color so it wasn't just a pale white of the paper. If you don't paint a little color beforehand, you're going to have that paper sticking through with these white spots, and honestly, I don't think it looks all that great. I'm going to switch. I got two different brushes that I'm going to play around with for the trees. Honestly, most people will probably tell you for the little leaves to kind of dab those things in with your round brush, like a skinny round brush, and just kind of like tap, tap, tap them in. Truthfully, I kind of like a flat brush, and what I'll do is I'll probably use this thin flat brush. You want to make sure you don't dribble water all over your work too, because it'll sink in and kind of make a sort of a bleed mark. Now for the start of the trees, again, I'm going to start with the yellows. I've wet my brush. My brush is sufficiently soaked, but I'm going to take a little bit of the water off it. I don't want it really, really wet. I also don't want it bone dry. You shouldn't ever really use the paint with like a totally dry brush with totally just paint out of the tube. You should always have just a little bit of water. And then even within making like my trees and my sort of texture of my trees, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the lighter yellow first. So I didn't really mix anything. I'm taking some of the light yellow out of the tube, sort of dip my brush a little bit into it, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of pat. I'm going to get you from an angle like this. Just going to kind of pat with the brush almost like vertically on the paper. I'm going to try not to have really much water on there, and I'm going to sort of alternate like a little angle and things like that, just to kind of create a little bit of just sort of unevenness. I'm going to go ahead with that lightest yellow. I'm going to do a little bit of that first. Really, I'm not adding much water to this, but what I am doing is sort of just patting it in there. I'm going to take a little bit of the other yellow I have that's a little closer to orange, and I'm going to look at those trees, and generally like on the edges I think they can be kind of yellowish, but in some of the areas where it gets a little darker, you know, we want a little variation. So I'm going to again sort of like just tap the brush in there and creating just a little bit of texture and things like that. Tiny little taps, just like that. All right, with that, honestly, I would do a little bit more of my other trees, but I'm going to kind of add a little bit more to this tree while I'm working on it here. I'm going to grab a little bit of the yellow ochre, which is slightly a little bit more brown. Kind of mix it in with a little bit of that orange, and I'm going to hit a few of these little spots to kind of create a little bit more texture. and light and shadow. And then even within there, I'm going to take a little tiny bit of the green and red mix that I made the other day. A little water to it. Palette's kind of dried up, so you can always add a little bit of water and loosen the paint up. But for some of these things that you're doing right now, you might want to actually set up a little bit of fresh paint. What I'll do down over here, I'll just kind of hit some of this up with just a little bit of marks, like so. I can do like the tree that's next to it with that dark green. Kind of pat the brush into it. The thing about the trees is try to make them a little bit uneven and irregular. And for some of those really, really dark ones, what I'll do is just kind of like, I'll touch the paper vertically first a little bit, like the treetop, and then like with the corner of the brush, just kind of tap the paper a little bit. Trying to make marks that are not always like equal or even. And I'll start building up some of the thickness of my forest. A little bit of the green, a little bit of the red. Right here I'll kind of just touch a little bit vertically. And kind of like the corner of the side of the brush, kind of like hit the paper a little bit. Sometimes barely touching it, sometimes pressing down a little bit more. Denser as we get down towards the bottom. All right, that's going to give me some of my little touches of trees. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to clean my brush, and I'm going to do a bunch of the yellow trees first, and then I'm going to come back and do a little bit more of the green. Make sure that my brush is nice and clean, not really wet, just a little bit of some dip to it. I'll start with my yellow. Go ahead and kind of fill in some of that area with yellow. Just kind of just the edge of the brush touching the paper. And go ahead and work on some of those areas so I can do more than one of these trees at a time. Vertical. And kind of do them in a little bit of a cluster. Get in here with a little bit of that orange. I'm not even really cleaning my brush off. Adding just a touch of water, dipping in that orange, mixing it a little bit with that yellow, and I'm going to come back and kind of try to sort of irregular marks, just a little bit, add a little bit more texture. Sometimes just barely touch the paper. Other times just a little bit more. These trees that are kind of like, this one's further back, the one next to it over here is closer to me on the sort of depth of the picture. I'll leave a little bit of yellow space, like this is the front end of that tree that's catching a little bit of light, and what I'm going to do is going to make this side of the tree a little bit darker, and that's going to kind of help one tree kind of stand out a little bit from the next. I'm going to pull in just the tiniest bit of green, mix it into my yellow here. Just a little touch of green. I think these are trees that are changing, obviously, so you can come in with a little bit of green, but that would be something that I add later into the mix. And honestly, for the forest of trees like this, you're going to be, I mean, if you like this kind of stuff, and if you're into just zoning out a little bit for a little while, it'll give you a nice little Bob Ross Zen happy little trees moment. You're just kind of like tapping a little bit into them. Okay. And I'll come in with just a little bit more green, not yellow, and then the green, I'll just a tiny touch of red. That red and green give me a little bit of a brownish green. Go in there and just mix up a little bit on my palette, kind of make a lower intensity color. This is what I'm going to use for my sort of darker side of the tree. Like I said, this side of the tree will be sort of coming into just hidden behind the other one. Come back a little bit more. You can fake in a couple like branches. Right there, that's just green and red pretty saturated together. I'm gonna go ahead and take a little bit more green, just a touch of water. And what I'm gonna do is work on this sort of little bits of darkness in the background. Just tapping the brush in there. This is, I'm faking some trees in the background, or more so I'm trying to create a little bit of shadow and depth in between these and trying to make a rough edge for what will be the tree. I can always kind of get a couple vertical marks in here. Brush is kind of dry, but not like, not bone dry. Like it's a little moist, and that gives me the ability to, I'm going to keep tapping like this. If you just tap a couple times and you see like everything looks kind of, you know, like nothing happened, or I have to go back and get more paint every time, it means your brush is probably a little bit too dry. If that's the case, take just a little bit of water. I got a napkin over here off camera that I'm just tapping into before I get back into the paint. And I'm just adding a few more rando trees. And generally what you're going to find is light color tends to come forward and make the things look like it's in the front. Dark color tends to recede. So just by making this edge over here a little bit darker, it makes the yellow tree in front of it kind of pop out a little bit. I'll give this just a little vertical mark. Taps. As we get down into that denser area where there's going to be a lot more sort of brush in action, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit more red to that green. Just kind of make some of that a little bit darker, as if it's kind of sinking back a little bit further. And, you know, it's going to be the gist of a lot of these trees. I don't know how many more I have to do to show, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep on painting unless anyone wants to stop me. And I'll do a little bit more, and then, you know, I'll start doing some of the stuff by the riverbed too. Clean brush. Back into my yellow. Yellow never really covers all that well, but I like to put down the lighter color first. That way, kind of get that out of the way. And other thing I'll tell you is, you know, as you come lower and lower into the picture plane, that's closer and closer, which should mean that things get a little bigger and bigger. Let me squeeze out. I got to take out a little bit more yellow in my palette. And obviously we're using the picture as a reference. You don't have to do every tree that you see in it. A little orange. Brush was a little too dry there. Tiny touch of green. This tree's a little bit more developed than the other ones. You get a little bit of the mustard yellow ochre color. The tiniest bit of the red and green into it, just to kind of make it just a little bit darker. And that'll give me a little bit of brown. That's the green, red, and a little bit of yellow ochre. And add a little bit more depth into this tree. Do here. I'm gonna take my green, a little bit of that red, a nice dark sort of brown color. Edge of the same brush. Kind of like little hints at branches kind of sneaking out in between some bases of those trees. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go with some of that bright green, a little bit of the yellow, tiny touch of water. Start the next tree with just a little bit of light green. This one's going to be a big tree. More color. Gonna get the green. Now this time with just a touch of red, kind of make a slightly darker green, closer to the core, closer to the trunk. It'll be a little heavier, a little less light gets in there. And come in and pat it with a little bit of the dark green. Maybe a little touch on this darker side. Core this tree a little bit darker. A few branches that don't quite get as much sunlight. A little too brown right there. A little bit more green. Down here, a little heavier because we are like in the shadows. And then what I'll do is take that same dirty brush, I'll dip into a bit more of that green and then right into the red. And I'll get a nice dark, muddy bit of color. I'll take the edge of that same flat brush. Kind of break the line a little bit just so it looks like somewhere like leaves are covering it a little bit. And I'm not going to make too many branches this way, but it's just a couple little dark marks. Thinner the better. And the first little tree up front over there. And I'm just going to continue with some more trees. Actually, you know what? Let's do a little bit of what's up front over here. I can continue on with trees for forever, but you know what? I'll switch over. I'll do a little bit of the some tall grass in the front. And I'm just kind of here with the light yellow first, kind of dabbing a little bit. And just get a little texture in there. Gonna a couple little patches. I'm gonna do the stuff by the trees first. Working background to foreground. I think I want to touch the green and that yellow. A nice light green and too much green, but it doesn't matter. It's a little too dry. Bigger marks, maybe as you get closer to the front. We'll go ahead. And now what I'm going to do is a little green, little yellow, tiny bit of red. I'm going to kind of get a brownish, slightly greenish brownish tone. You know, the light's hitting the top of these little shrubs and everything else like that. So we should get a little bit of dark kind of on the underneath of them. And that's the yellow, the green, and just a little bit of the red. And for like what you want to consider is like the underneath parts, these little sets of bushes or tall grass or however you want to consider it. If you need to, you can kind of a little bit right on the top to kind of help the top of that little line of bushes kind of stick out a little bit. I'll even go even a slightly darker tone. And I'll do some right at the bottom here. Right down by where they come out of the ground. Okay. All right. We've got this sort of rocky nonsense out in the front over here, or rough texture. And then we get some more vegetation up by the riverbed. I guess what I'll do is, let me see, I'm going to switch over brushes. I'm going to go with a smaller round brush. And get a little bit of the mustard yellow color. I'm trying to mix right now red, green, and that mustard yellow, and I'm just trying to get a brown. I don't want it to be really, really dark because there isn't a lot of really darkness in there. But what I do want to do is just a slightly darker value. And the reason I've kind of switched up brushes is just to kind of get a different look and feel, so that the ground here doesn't necessarily match up or looks too much like the bushes. What I'm going to do is just kind of try to make some irregular horizontal marks just to kind of add a little bit of texture to it. I mean, they're going to sit there and paint every single little last rock in there. So I'm going to kind of make a few of these little rando marks. Just trying to just touch the brush to the canvas. As I get closer and lower into the picture plane, further down, what I'm going to do is kind of make those marks a little bit longer and a little bit further apart. I'm going to go ahead and mix one slightly darker version of the color, and I'm just going to kind of come in with some really tiny other little marks with that dark color, just to kind of give a little bit more texture in there. And the same thing as I'm going down the picture plane, a little bit more space between marks. So down here there's less marks. Up here it's just a little bit more concentrated. And then I'm gonna start doing some of my little, I guess, the tall grass right in front of the riverbed. I can do it a couple different ways. Let me just see. You know what? I'm going to do some of these now with my little round brush. So I went from that stumpy brush that I was just patting directly into the paper to kind of make the trees and the textures of the trees. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the round brush. I'm just going to use it a little bit differently. I'm going to use a lot of the same colors and almost in the same way. The light sort of parts first. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a bit of yellow, and I'm just going to kind of make little vertical dashes. With just a bright yellow. As I get further and further down the picture plane, scale changes, so my marks will be a little bit longer over here. And I'm going to go to my orange. A little bit of water, loosen it up. I'm going to make sure that little marks with the orange are not covering the top of that yellow. So it's like yellow on top, and then like as a little further down goes to orange. Touch of green. Some of them have little green areas, and what I'll say is I'm gonna kind of make my little bushes a little erratic. There's like patches here and there with a little bit of green markings to them here and there. And now I'm going to go with that a bit of green, a bit of red, mix a little bit of everything that's on my brush to kind of make a little bit of a muddy, darker green. Sort of the bottom. The tall grass over there. Bigger marks. Lower into the picture plane. What am I gonna do? Just about at the end of the day, so I'm going to. What am I going to do? I'll make a little bit of the edge of the riverbed, at least on that side, and we'll call it a day for today. Plain brush. Dot it up a little bit. Smaller dots further away. Bigger dots closer to the bottom. You guys can, if you haven't logged out already, you can leave whenever you want. I'll post the video if you want it. Key to a lot of this stuff is not trying to make things too much like a pattern. So like a little bit erratic, like some spots just a little bit darker and slightly different color. And then what I'll do is I'll take a little bit of a slightly wet brush. Kind of pull just a little bit of that out. That would be how I handle my sort of edge of the river. I'm going to do those little bumps and everything else like that. As far as other like twigs and things like that, as you see, you can always mix yourself a nice dark brown. Green and red will do. I wouldn't use black anywhere. This is just going to require a real steady hand, and if you have to use a smaller brush, but this is just like... Make one a little bit too thick. Just make it longer and taller and try to... the edge of the brush touching. And as you start, like, brush starts to feel a little bit drier, that's when you're going to be able to make some really thin, tiny marks. And then I would make your little branches and things like that. And you can go add those things, to your heart's delight. All right. Guys, if you're still there, have a very good weekend.